Thank you very much, Ricky. I thought that I would rather introduce myself. I am going to be talking about China a little bit, but it's a little bit. Actually, what I'm talking about more generally is the challenges facing our profession, and some lessons we can learn from China, but some lessons that we learn from our situation right here, some lessons that we learn from the private sector, from the public sector, and from general things, trends happening around us. This is a paper I presented to the AZA conference in Cape Town 2 or 3 weeks ago. So because not all of us were there, I felt perhaps I'll take the opportunity to present it here as well. So thank you very much for taking time for being here. I'm going to stay seated because it's a nice and small, intimate venue, and I'm going to just run through slides here. I have a paper that I've written, so if you wouldn't mind that I read it, because some of the nuances I may forget. But I'm speaking to you today in a humble attempt to convince you of 3 things. 1, South African cities are in a state of crisis. 2, architectural practice in South Africa is facing an impending crisis. And 3, there is a pressing and urgent new role for the architect to play in this country. We are living in a beautiful time. This, incidentally, was just my brag photograph, because we came back, hi Lorinda, hi Rush. At the same conference we went down to, we were very, very happy, and we want to brag about the Award of Excellence that was received for the Ubuntu Center. John Blair was not able to make the event, but I was able to be there to receive on behalf of John Blair's Stanfield and our practice for the Ubuntu Center. Some of you know about it. And there were 4 awards that were received that night for PE practices. 2 from Tembela, Awards of Merit. 1 for the Matrix, an Award of Merit. And then ourselves, an Award of Merit for the Ubuntu Center and an Award of Excellence. So we were very happy with that. And I just thought I could use the opportunity to brag, so thanks for listening to that. And then I presented the paper that morning. But what I was dwelling on is the fact that we're living in a beautiful time. It's a time of elevated consciousness, a time of a new awareness of our intimate relationship with the planet as a living, breathing, interconnected but finite sustaining system. We are living in a time when we have come to reject the ugly and embrace beauty. We have collectively rejected bad coffee. We have embraced artisan breads and handmade cheeses. The Arab Spring has rejected the ugly leadership that was finding itself there in a wave of contagious disgust. There is a desire for all things authentic, fresh from the farm, BBC food, and pavement cafes. We have abandoned macho black hats for politicians. We've abandoned the stiff upper lip. We have slowly overcome the worst of our Victorian puritanism. We are dealing slowly with our bigotry. We live in a beautiful time. Yet still, no matter how we look at it, South African cities 18 years into democracy can all be described without exception in the terms town and township. We can still, everywhere we go, town and township. Yet still, in spite of good policy documents, South African cities have continued to become massive, sprawling, polluting, fossil fuel dependent, crime-ridden poverty traps. These cities, in which 50% of our population now live and work, are monuments to inefficiency and environmental arrogance. To this day, our cities remain memorials to apartheid's most visible and vicious social engineering projects, divided between rich and poor, black and white, well-serviced and poorly serviced. But perhaps what is worse is that far from undoing this divisive sprawl, our model of development since 1994 has continued to perpetuate this failed pattern. As we speak, this pattern is playing itself out in the city to which I've dedicated my professional life thus far, where, if big private capital has its way, Nelson Mandela Bay will, in coming months, see massive new sprawling developments beyond Motherwell to the east and outside Sherwood to the west of the metro. The process is now well underway to obtain approval for a 6 billion rand mixed residential development beyond Motherwell on the road to Addo. And the EIA has been approved for a massive new regional shopping centre, Bay West, to the west along the N2. The question, I suppose, is, have we as a community of architects stopped to think what we are allowing to happen here? Do we even realize that we are allowing it to happen by our inaction? Should we be giving up hope that our cities can become things of beauty? Are we happy that our cities, and especially our townships, continue their low-density sprawl endlessly like a tumor consuming the landscape? Our government support for welcome Sean Fogarty, welcome Sean Belford. You aren't late, but you're all just very early and eager to get here. Just by way of introduction, I'm talking through a paper that I presented and taped on Sean. I don't know if you, so it's not a repeat show. Our government support for ugly anti-urban developments of this nature seems strange and contradictory and confusing, especially since it has become generally understood that the economy can no longer afford to keep building environmentally destructive, sprawling cities in the way that we have been doing so since World War II. Government policy documents since breaking new ground and the first drafts of our National Planning Commission documents are clear that South African cities need to be accessible, compact, and break away from their divisive spatial and physical past. To add insult to injury, South African cities are also reminders of another massive mistake of recent history. The mistake with which, greetings Rory, greetings Richard, the mistake with which we must now rapidly come to terms is that South African cities have been designed under the false assumption and the lie that cheap fossil fuels will make themselves available in perpetuity. This is now proving to be a colossal and expensive design mistake. The International Energy Agency have told us that global oil production has continued to increase year on year since oil was first extracted from the ground in the US in 1859, but that production has now peaked. In fact, the consensus is that oil production peaked sometime in 2006 already. In other words, every year since 1859, the world was able to meet its increased demand for fossil fuels by simply finding new oil wells or drilling deeper into old ones. But now, supply is rapidly declining, while demand continues to grow unchecked, most notably to meet the needs of the growing Chinese and Indian markets. While the impact of peak oil is now broadly understood, what I would prefer to focus on is what this means for how we approach the design of our cities looking forward. Firstly, I would suggest, let us concede that we have got it all horribly wrong up to now. And this is an important first step that we need to make. South African cities are of very low density and have sprawled very, very widely. The brutal truth is that the general public are going to have to pay a very heavy price for this design error. It is soon going to become unbearably expensive to move around in private motor vehicles. It is soon going to become unbearably expensive to distribute food and goods. It is soon going to become unbearably expensive for police to patrol or for municipalities to collect refuse. Even if our cities suspend their sprawling today, it's still going to be very, very tough. But what are architects to do about this? Is there a role for architects to play in helping us move out of this crisis? Are we up to the task? The architect in contemporary society takes on sometimes the guise of teacher, sometimes the guise of bureaucrat, sometimes the guise of employee in a private sector developer. But most of all, the architect in private practice is what we see as being typical. and many of us here are architects in private practice. The architect in private practice makes up the majority of our kind and is perhaps the most visible to the public. But I'm afraid in practice we have got our energies diverted away from the challenge of envisaging a better urban future. We have become obsessed with geometry, blinded by fashion and seduced by style. Our students hang on to every word of celebrity architects who are perhaps better described as entertainers than as champions of the built environment. There are, on the rare occasion where architects have come to work in the townships, the areas most need of intervention, areas experiencing the crisis most intensively, areas where the cities display their most ugly selves, architects seem to have completely misunderstood the question. As architects, we seem to have completely failed to see where our real contribution can be made and where it is most needed. We have allowed ourselves to get caught up in the notion that somehow marginalized people, read black people in the South African context, are a special case that requires architects to apply a special methodology, a special approach. Our recent past has seen very many architects unfamiliar with townships or rural areas being tripped up and stumbling over an appropriate cultural response, considering perhaps the users and their clients as being foreign, different, or peculiar. These architects consider the brief for a township project as would an American casino architect considering a conceptual response to a commission in the South Pacific. What are the symbols and materials that are meaningful to these strange people, you would ask? Invariably, the design becomes a patronizing series of palm-leafed, round-poled, out-of-scale structures that speaks more about the architect's ignorance and his snapshot whirlwind visit preconception of the South Pacific island in question than it does to the cultural aspirations of the subject islanders. I would argue that architects in practice are limited by their tendency to misunderstand the question. I would argue that architects are limited by underestimating their potential contribution to the larger, more pressing urban challenges. I would argue that architects are limiting themselves in believing, without any supporting evidence, that some other grouping is best placed to provide the leadership and to do the thinking that is required to turn our cities into the quality environments that support good living. There is a vague, unsubstantiated view that town planners or civil engineers or elected office bearers are dealing with getting all of this fixed. There's no scientific evidence to suggest that this is true at all. Even inside our profession, we have begun to think that to contemplate design of spaces in between buildings is somehow the work of specialists who call themselves urban designers. A further fragmentation that weakens our role, in the same way as the fragmenting of the project management discipline as something distinct from what architects normally do. This fragmentation and this limiting view is contagious and severely limits the way in which client organizations, especially public sector clients, interact with the architect in private practice. In public sector projects, the irrational, unsubstantiated belief among government departments is that the best way to harness the energies of an architect in turning our cities into happy, vibrant, life-supporting communities is to fragment the design into small, unrelated, simplistic components and to put these fragmented design tasks out to tender, where cost of fees will determine the architect most suited for the task.